on the screen anymore. I've worked out how
No, we've just gone live, mate.
camera.
No, we've just gone live.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone, once again to We Are the Builders Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are, broadcasting here from the various traditional lands of First People. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are, broadcasting here from the various traditional lands of First People. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are... Joe, stay on mute, please. Broadcasting here from the various traditional lands of First People. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are... Joe, stay on mute, please. Broadcasting here from the various traditional lands of First People. Oh, something went wrong there. I don't know what that was. That was weird. And anyway,
it was that kind of feedback.
All right, let's kick this off again. Well, the show must go on. And we have our Spinal Tap moment as well. If anyone's wanting to know what that means, it's a legendary comedy film, a rockumentary. This is Spinal Tap. I highly recommend it. You can understand what could go wrong, does go wrong. But however, look, we are broadcasting from the various traditional lands of the First People of the nations, and I'm from the land. I'm currently on the land of the Jar Jar Wurrung, and I like to acknowledge all those people, elders, past, present, and future. Acknowledge that this struggle was a fight against invasion and the anti-colonial struggle, which also has now developed in a broader struggle against imperialism. Well, tonight we are going to actually discuss about banking, and we do have some material here which Joe's prepared, and there's some classic material as well. But before we go ahead, I'd just like to welcome Helen and Joe. How are you today?
Good.
Good, thanks, Dave. I think this, and Joe, thanks for the material. I think this is going to be a challenging topic, and I think it's going to be great.
Good.
Great to get our heads around it.
I'm just going to close that for a sec. That's all good. Just going to close that. Okay, well, we're going to kick it off. And Joe, I know we discussed this earlier, but would you like to lead the discussion? And obviously, I'll try and endeavour to share some of the material up there as well. For any of the viewers, currently people watching from various streams, feel free to put some questions in the comments, and we'll try to endeavour to talk through this. But there is some heavy reading here. It's Marx's classic, but it's fantastic as well. All right, over to you, Joe.
Well, I'll just start off with a bit of an explanation, and before we go on, I think there's a small number of definitions, just very quickly, because they may be terms that people are not familiar with. But let's start off by saying that the banks are not exactly popular in Australia. They haven't been for some time. And the understanding normally is that run by a bunch of crooks, they rip people off and all the rest of it. And as you know, here in Australia, there was a Royal Commission into the banks, forced by the sentiment of the population that they demanded it. The report came out with, the evidence was pretty condemning. The banks, the report came out with a series of recommendations which were fairly reasonable. Normally you don't expect that from a Royal Commission. But no sooner had that come out than it was forgotten, it was buried, nothing was done about it. And that alone is proof of the economic and political power that the banks, or rather those who are behind the banks, have in Australian society. I don't think it's too different to many other countries, but that's an enormous amount of power. Imagine almost anyone else going through that, through public uproar, having a major investigation, damning evidence coming out, recommendations for action coming out from that instrument, and nothing gets done about it. The government, the opposition, Don't talk about it. People just need to think of that level of power over society. So that's really the starting point. And it's really on its own, really tells us we need to understand what's going on there, because sooner or later society needs to do something about it. In Australia, when people talk about the banks, they think automatically the big four. Those in Australia know who they are. Four banks that basically are it, as far as the day-to-day dealings of most people. But it goes much further than this. It is not just about these banks, it's about a whole structure that exists. And it's about a section of capitalism sitting on top of the pyramid and really controlling most of the rest. So let me start off. The key to that is who has control over the centralization and concentration of capital. First definition, centralization just means that in order for modern society to operate, capital is centered somewhere. There is a pool somewhere. And the best way to describe that, the easiest way, is banks, the Reserve Bank, but also the other banks. Concentration of capital means that bigger masses of capital fall into fewer hands. So you get some people, you get some capitalists, in this case, who have in their possession enormous sums of capital. Both of those are needed for what tonight is going to be all about. The connection to Australia, the decision made by the British politicians and those behind them to send exploration ships to the Great Southern Land, which became Australia eventually, had a lot to do with international trade. Really, that was the foundation. The UK was moving into Southeast Asia, which then was called the Spice Islands. Spices were worth more in their weight than gold, so they made a fortune for whoever had them. They were also going to the Americas and so on. This period of exploration and grabbing lands gave rise to a group of people. They always existed, well, at least for thousands of years, but now they became richer and more powerful. They're called merchants. So this group of merchants emerged during this period, and they emerged first in London, first place in the world. And they sat down, and we'll come into this later, how they invented banking. And as a sideline connection to it, insurance. In Australia, we see this connection with the merchants of London, who had turned themselves into bankers, with some of the stuff that was early exported from around Australia, like whales or whale oil, whale fat. But then the big time came when sheep appeared to supply the textile mills of northern England. But it was the financiers who were really the big players in that. They'd already become fairly dominant. So let's have a look at how, because this is what we need to look at, how society produces and creates surplus value and how it is distributed through circulation. So this is the next definition. Surplus value refers to that value added to anything that is made, which is an excess of what has been the investment, what has been put into it. So it's something new that's created. And I won't go into details on how that comes about, but just take it at this point that this value is created because it is surplus to the investment that was originally put in. It's called surplus value. So is that clear? We are looking at the distribution of the surplus value. And we're looking at the rise of what became rentier capitalism. So rentier capitalism are capitalists who specialize in finance. And this gave rise, when they became dominant, to what became called the financial oligarchy. So from that, we need to look at a few points about the financial oligarchy. Who owns what? The financial oligarchy, as we'll see, mainly, well, not mainly, they operate through the ownership of shares. They directly and indirectly, they use companies to buy shares in other companies. They form cartels, and they connect through financial ties to other capitalists, or they tie other capitalists to them. Lenin famously called these people coupon clippers. What he meant is that they did nothing except collect dividends and interest and a few other financial instruments they benefited from. But essentially, they weren't involved in production. They weren't involved in anything else. And we know today that these people, they don't even manage their own portfolio investments. They employ somebody else to do it for them. So they do usually pretty much absolutely nothing. But they are very wealthy, extremely wealthy and powerful. So we need to look at that. And Marx called a term that can be applied to these at certain circumstances. He called it parasitism. Parasitism. In other words, these people are parasites on society. So if we go on to that, we can begin looking at the first part of the reading material. Now, just bear with me, other people. There are a couple of typos here because it is a draft. So we'll get around that. So do you want to, Joe, do you want me to start reading, or does somebody else want to go?
Can I just read on that issue of banks being parasites, Joe?
Yeah, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I do. Just
Yeah.
give me one sec. It's Bertolt Brecht.
Brecht.
Is that how you say
Brecht.
it? He's a poet, a German poet.
Bertolt Brecht.
Yep. He made the comment, what is the crime of robbing a bank compared to the crime of founding one? And I think that's telling in that banks are, as you say, the financiers and the bankers are parasites on society. And I think that quote is very descriptive of that.
The only qualification I'd put on that is that banks are still necessary for modern society. It is when banks and the way they operate and the way the owners operate do not act in harmony with the needs of society that they become parasites. In other words, Marx would have or did express it in terms of they come into contradiction with the mode of production. So, in other words, the process of creating commodities and circulating, they come in contradiction with it. They interfere with it. That's when they become parasites. Which brings up another term, suppose definition.
Can I just
the mode of
Joe,
production.
Sorry, can I just stop you, Dave? I think you need to mute. We've got some feedback coming that's disturbing.
Yeah. The mode of production, I should have said in the outset, is a big thing because it refers to, it has two parts to it. It is the instruments that are used to make something, so machinery, tools, and so on. Also, but it also has the social relations that arise between individuals and different sections of society. So we need to consider the mode of production being the combined. or the total of the two. So that's really important, because I think one of the big weaknesses of, say, pro-capitalist economics is that it doesn't do that. It separates it. It has a technical view of the world, and we shouldn't. And sometimes Marxists do make the same mistake. Okay, from there, I suppose Dave. Wait to see if you got something to say.
Well, no, I mean, when reading this, and I think a lot of it, and I think it's got to be a basic understanding why we're here now, why the banks are like they
Yes.
are. And I think that's vitally important. It's not just because banks are awful institutions. That's just, it's not actually getting to the root cause of the problem and what's primary. And I think what's fantastic about this material, it's actually focusing on what's primary. And out of that then leads to secondary. Because, I mean, we got banks under a socialist system. They use banks to fund projects, to fund community development, all sorts of things. So it's important, and that shows it also a direct contrast or the difference between banks under socialism and banks under capitalism, what they're primarily for, making profit. So that's rather important. I'll just say to once again to any viewers, I'll put a little comment there. Feel free to ask questions. We'll try to address them if there's any confusion as well. So because there is some stuff that can be a little heavy read and take time to absorb, but feel free to do that. One of us can address them. So
can I come up before we start, because I noticed there's one at the beginning, a definition, because that might confuse people. And I mentioned surplus value, but it's also a term called social surplus value. The difference between the two: surplus value refers to the process in a single enterprise. Social surplus value refers to the sum of surplus value created in all enterprises in society and becomes part of a bigger whole, which is outside the single enterprise. So it is the total of society. That's why it's called social. And the other one, and that's the last one now, is the word realization, which often creates confusion. It was Marx himself invented it for this purpose. And that is when commodities, that is what is produced, the objects that are produced, that come out of production, must go into circulation. When they go into circulation and it's completed, the circulation is completed, it's been realized. So realization is that process of creating commodities and circulating them. So I hope that's clear. Okay, so that's the last one. And pipe up if anybody says they're confused about something at a point. I don't know what that means.
Well, Joe, just on that, so the circulation, does it also mean the buying and selling of goods? Is that part of circulation?
Yes. Although from a Marxist point of view, we don't look at from the viewpoint of buyers and sellers. I mean, you can, and it amounts to the same thing, but it's usually looked at in terms of, money, which also comes in money and commodities circulating within the economy.
How do they circulate? By the buying and selling process in the
market? They do. It's just that as long as people are clear of what's been talked about, it doesn't matter really which term you use.
Okay, good.
So what I'll do just before we continue, I'll put the formula in the chat session so people can follow. That's on the first part about distribution of social surplus value.
Yeah. So do you want me to start on that? That's okay. So the first chapter is the distribution of the social surplus value. It is often assumed that the capitalist merely claims surplus value at a particular point of production. This is wrong. Part of what the earlier chapters have shown, and we're not seeing this today, is that the capitalist does not make a claim on the on the surplus value created on an individual process of production, but stakes a claim on the social surplus value. That's it. In other words, the claim that the capitalist gets, who's involved in production, amounts to nothing unless what has been produced is circulated and the process of realization happens. That's what that means. Again, it says through the circulation of commodities and money. This association between production, circulation, and the resulting claim on the social surplus value is known as realization. Realization is not possible without the circulation of both commodities and money. The circulation of commodities allows the creation of a social surplus value. The circulation of money allows all participants in society to make a claim on the final social surplus value through profit, rent, wages. That is wrong. That was supposed to go being crossed out. We'll talk about it's the value. It's not the surplus value, and I'll explain why in a second. But it's profit, interest, and rent, which Marx dealt with. But there are other means, particularly these days, where a capitalist can convert a part of the social value into through other means. Okay, so moving on. Production, circulation.
No. I think we should stop there. I think we need to have a bit of a discussion about this. So, are you saying in there, Joe? And I'm going to throw questions at you because I think this will help our viewers. So, are you saying that the social surplus value wages are also part of that?
No, that's what I said. That's a typo.
Oh,
or something that should have gone out. So wages are not part of that. Wages are part of the initial investment that went into production of the commodity. It's the payment for labour power that's been used, embedded in there.
So when an accountant does the books, they consider wages to be part of the expenses, not part of.
No, they don't. What an accountant does, they look at it the same way as a Marxist would. They use different terms. They calculate for constant capital they call fixed capital, and variable capital they call variable capital. So they do the same thing. It's universal. I mean, that's not a point of disagreement. The point of disagreement is what happens to it. Yeah. And how it operates. But so we can assume that it's universally agreed that that's the case. So wages, even by accountants, are not not part of the expenses. The expenses are taken out. For instance, tax is an expense. So, the cost of capital to an accountant is not an expense. It is a cost, but it's not an expense. There is a difference.
Okay.
An expense is something, it's a cost that's outside that core. Okay.
So when we're looking at the first paragraph, and it says that the capitalist does not make a claim on the surplus value created on an individual process. Can I rephrase that and say then that our society would like us to think that a capitalist is only claiming surplus value on their one factory, for instance, say it's a factory, because then that hides the nature of something?
Yeah, you could say that. I think that's there's also a lot of confusion, and capitalist economics doesn't. It fudges it rather than opposes it. But Yeah, I think the part is because they talk about this thing about entrepreneurship creating value. It's true in a sense, but only in the sense that you look at what that person does. If they're involved in managing an enterprise and they're an essential part of it and they facilitate the creation of commodities, then they're contributing a form of labour power. So it's just like any other labour power. The same thing as an engineer or or different skills within a single enterprise. They're all necessary. They're all parts of it, but they contribute through the form of labour power, not through some sort of magical sort of ability or, because they contribute capital. Capital's nothing. It's inactive. It's inanimate. Doesn't do anything. Only when human beings use it does it do anything. You can have two pieces of wood. They don't glue themselves together on their own. Some human being has to come and put them together and, put glue between them and so on. And that's how it's operated. And that's where the difficulty is. That's what won't be admitted by capitalist economics.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? Why is it important to understand that the capitalist stakes a claim on the social surplus value of society and not on their individual process of production? So why is that important?
Yeah, two reasons. One is that to understand how society really operates. I mean, that's and how the economy really operates. But the second one is to understand that workers as a class or individually are not primarily exploited by their employer, but they're exploited by capitalism as a whole or by a class, not merely an individual.
Just before we proceed, I'll just also clarify if anyone wants to know what a commodity actually is. It is a product made for exchange. So, for example, the table I'm at the moment, it's used primarily for my own use. It's there to prepare food and consume food, for example, even doing what we're doing now, live study, reading, whatever. But if I want to exchange this table for 4 chairs, for example, I need 4 chairs. Well, that's when it will become a commodity. Because it's not for my use.
And that's tied to
Mark.
Yeah,
that was actually pretty much what Marx kicked off in Capital.
Yeah.
Started off on what the commodity was. So that just gives you it's a basic form of commodity exchange. We can talk about use value and labour value and what makes it valuable, but I just wanted to make that clarify. That's what they mean by commodity.
Yeah. And it's tied to, a non-commodity, something that's not a commodity, just a product, is for your own consumption. So as soon as you make it for someone else's consumption, it becomes a commodity. And that's interesting because that is what sets up new social relations, right? You may be involved with somebody else to produce for self-consumption, but as soon as you start exchanging that for something else with someone else, you're setting up new social relations that the whole process depends on.
But does it only become a commodity when it's sold?
Not necessarily.
It's exchange.
It's exchange. So even you can barter. But, and this is a point that commodities are not a creation of capitalism. They've been around, at least 12,000 years. But they take a different character. In feudal society, generally, most commodities were exchanged in kind. It's only with the development of commodities where commodities are exchanged through the intermediary of money. So commodity production, in other words, takes on a new form with the rise of capitalism. And that brings up, because one of the misunderstandings is that capitalism equals the market. Well, the market's been around since exchange began. That is a market. That's the definition. But it takes on particular form under capitalism, and it takes different forms under different social systems. And
it will do in the future as well, take on a
yeah,
different form.
yeah. Now, I continue. Production, circulation, the various means to make a claim on the social surplus value are united as parts of the social relationships associated, which has been said, with the existing economic base. This is what allows human beings to exist as players in the economy in its complete sense and within a world of circulation. So that means it's what allows us to both to be workers or capitalists, but also allows us to be buyers and sellers and all the rest of it.
And I think,
If we,
sorry,
yeah,
Joe, can I just make the point there that if we, it also, being able to be a buyer and seller as a worker makes us think, especially nowadays with our neoliberalism and the individualism of the nature of the society we live in now. We think that because we can buy and sell things like capitalists, that therefore we lose our class connection, because so we no longer see us, because we're buying and selling, or buying in particular, we forget that we're part of a class. Would that be correct?
yeah,
Or we think,
and that's natural in the sense because what it does, and the capitalist theory augments that, is that capitalism gives a surface appearance that our main function, our number one function in society is as sellers and consumers or buyers, right? It's not, because behind that is our role as capitalist, working class, and other sections of society. So our relationships to the process of production is the basis of our existence in capitalist society, not as a consumer. Capitalism feeds that illusion naturally. Of course, the marketing industry builds on it, and orthodox capitalist economic theory grab hold of it as a way to avoid some of the embarrassing questions. But that's why I hesitated at the beginning to mix the two, buying and selling and circulation, because of the illusion that's created. Okay, well, go. Yep. All right. If we consider profit, for example, it does not exist within the limits of a single enterprise. It can only exist within the context of many enterprises forming components of a single whole. This single whole is the sum of all production and all other economic activity in the given society. And it is in this bigger world that profit is made possible. And I want to extend to this because it's not only capitalists involved in production who make profit. There are other sorts of capitalists who also make profit. And if it was only coming out of a single enterprises, then all the other types of capitalists couldn't exist. They do exist. All members of this society compete for a share in the social surplus value. And that's part, if all members of this society, yeah, there is a qualification there which isn't written because, as I said before, the working class doesn't get its income from the surplus value, but there are many in society who do, other than capitalists. The middle strata, also a lot of workers who are not involved directly in production. Competition is most marked when it comes to contending classes. There is competition between capitalists, the capitalist and working class. There is competition between other classes. There is competition between distinct groups of capitalists. And this is something that needs to be taken on board because it has a huge impact on society and the way society is going. We don't understand, and we don't understand what's going on unless we know that it's not just everybody's working class who's having a go at everybody else who's capitalist. Is more complicated than that. Right? There are divisions within that.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question, Joe, about this surplus value? Is it when we talk about competing for the surplus value, is there a fixed sum of social surplus value?
No. Just how much? It's just the total sum of what's been created. So it does increase and decrease depending on the economic conditions. So society, which it means the economic base, is made more complex by this multifaceted competition. An important part of this complexity of the social relations is that production can't be accurately understood from the viewpoint of an isolated entity. A single capitalist does not make a profit from the direct exploitation of labour in one enterprise. Profit can only come through the exploitation of all capitals as a class from the surplus value created by all workers as a class. The broader context outlined here not only explains how the individual capitalist gains profit from production, it explains how a part of the surplus value is shared with other capitals not directly engaged in production. Moving on from here, we must explain how surplus value is transformed into the various shares like profit, rent, interest, and get the wages out. Don't know how that got in there. But so it's profit, interest, and rent. I'll add the rest shortly. It comes up. We will proceed from here. We will proceed from the viewpoint of the capitalist and the capitalist claim on the social surplus value through profit. The surplus value within the commodity must be converted into its money equivalent. For this to occur, the familiar cycle must be completed. And it's not familiar for tonight, but CMCM little a means that money, the capitalist converts money into a commodity. The commodity is then converted into money, plus the little a means plus a little bit extra.
Can I just show something? I just put the formula up there. I couldn't mix. I should have put the little a. I'll rewrite that again. Hang on for the viewers. I'll try to explain that. Put the little a there. Okay. So
that is basically, that's the objective. From the viewpoint of a capitalist, they are not in business so much to create commodities. They're in business to get more than the money they put in.
Yep.
In other words, they want a profit. And there's inherent contradictions we see in this. In this way, along with the circulation of commodities, a certain amount of money enters circulation as the equivalent commodity. Right? Anybody does understand is, in terms of value, money is itself a commodity. It has its own value. So a certain amount of value in terms of a commodity turns into a certain amount or an equal amount of value of money. That's why everything doesn't have the same price.
can I just add, Joe?
I won't go into this in detail here
Right.
because that's a fairly involved thing in itself. But just say that one commodity, so money's exchange, a commodity is exchanged for another commodity, which is what they produce, and then in circulating that commodity, the capitalist aims at realizing the initial investment plus something more. So clear? In this way, along with the circulation, I've gone through that. The circulation money as a commodity allows the capitalists to convert the commodities put into circulation for money, and money in turn allows the capitalists to make a claim on the social surplus value. So that's where that little a comes from, the claim on the social surplus value.
So can I just stop you there, Joe? So in terms of money being a mechanism for exchange, you're saying that it's not only that. It's not only a mechanism of exchange, it's also it also has its own value. Or
it does, because it couldn't be used as a mechanism for exchange unless it was itself a commodity. It's a commodity with specialist properties, but it is a commodity.
Because can I then say, so is it because it's is it because it's based on gold, or was based on gold, that it can become a commodity?
Because money is also something that created in the same way as other commodities. Well, in theory, anyway. It's more quickly now, but it's still the creation of money involves investment of capitals, but it also involves the creation of a surplus value. So it shares those characteristics with all commodities.
Yeah, I mean, originally, money was once created there for used for exchange. Basically, it was a measurement of exchange, or measurement of value. So, for example, I had $5. That allowed me then to exchange that for $5 worth of goods. Commodity. But $10, same thing. But what happens? It's through the process money is produced, and that way the value is created even further. But the point of sale, where surplus or profits realised. And that's where the money is used as commodity as well.
I mean, the value of money and the value of commodities, I'll insert this little bit in, is determined by a few things, but the origins of it is what Marx called use value, which simply means that if something is more useful to a person, they're prepared to exchange more for it. And
so, at what point did money become a commodity of itself, in and of itself?
In ancient times, from the first time somebody picked up a stone and polished it a little bit, or whatever they did with it, or a shell, that they invented money. And if they used that for exchange, it was a commodity to exchange for other commodities. So it's been around for a hell of a long time, and it's likely to be around for a while yet. Okay, I think I'm trying to find my spot again. We have seen in the basic model the surplus and social surplus value created. We have seen the surplus social value created is in part claimed by the immediate producer, the capitalist from whom money is borrowed, and the owner of the land and building, the landlord. Division of the surplus value amongst the distinct groups of capitalists can be expressed in the following way. So there's another equation, S equals P plus I plus R, which surplus value, S, P is profit, I is interest, and R is rent. But because this can only be realized through circulation, the basic model used so far must be transformed into one that stands not for the individual surplus value, but the total of all surplus values, taking the form of the social surplus value. So you convert it, and that's why it's the same one with little s's, just to make it, to distinguish it from the first one. Based on claiming the individual profits, interest, and rent from social totals of each through the surplus value, which has been converted into its money equivalent in circulation, the surplus value is proportioned out amongst all capitalists. So it's this process of circulation has to be made before profits, interest, and rent are paid out.
Joe, just before we continue, I
Yep.
was just going to say, when we're just talking about money as a commodity, here's an example. So once again, I'll explain what a commodity was. I have this table here. Once again, it's to prepare food and consume food from. I'm currently conducting live from here, or paperwork on that. We use it. But then, for example, someone out there needs a table, and I don't need it anymore, but I might need something else later on. I can't have anything at the moment. So, for example, so someone's got $50. They buy this table off me for $50. That's when that money comes. Now I've got nothing else to exchange. So instead of exchanging the table for 4 chairs, I've exchanged it for $50. So I've got the commodity in my hand now of a $50 note, and that allows me then to legal purchase of $50 worth of goods, what I need, what's useful for me in the future. So I then again exchange that for $50 worth of goods somewhere else from another buyer, potential, like groceries. It's a classic example. So that's just that gives you. I hope that sort of gives a bit of basic understanding when they meant by money is a commodity. That's what it means. So someone bought this table off me for $50. I got $50 in my hand. They got the table. Sure, and this $50 then can be now used in exchange for $50 worth of goods. Say, for example, there's some $50 worth of groceries from the local supermarket. That way, so then I've obtained it that way. So that gives you a little. I hope that makes it easy to understand, because sometimes it can get quite complex discussion if we want to try and keep it easy understood. I hope I've made that clear.
Yeah, could I add by making an example and how this works? Just say, Dave, you have a chair you can't use, so it's not so useful to you anymore. You've got a stack of chairs. You've crowded your place out, right? You need to get rid of the chair, but you might fancy an ice cream. At least as part of it. So the chair is useful because you can sit down on it. The rest do whatever you got to do sitting down. An ice cream has use value because it tastes okay. So you might want to sell a chair, but you don't want to get another chair. You just think, oh, geez, I'd fancy an ice cream. So you get your $50 and you go down the road and get an ice cream. Now, just pretend there's no shops. If you had somebody else that had suddenly landed with a truckload of ice creams, they don't know what to do with, then they're likely to want to get rid of some. If they need a chair, they might come and say, look, can I have your chair? So you multiply that through society many thousands of times. And one of the advantages of money is that it's a store of value. In other words, you don't have to exchange it right away. You can save it for another day, or you can exchange it for any combination of commodities that add to the same value. So that's a tremendous advantage of money. It also can create problems, but that's another story. But yeah, it's a complex society wouldn't be very workable if you couldn't do that. If you couldn't sort of, well, I'm not ready to eat the ice cream today. I'll eat it tomorrow. I'd like to eat it tomorrow instead. So if we go on, which is the next chapter, is the rise of rentier capitalism. I said before that is the name for those capitalists that specialize in what we'll now call finance. So let's start off with a little bit of history, how it emerged. So Britain was the first country where monopoly capitalism appeared. This began to appear in the mid-1800s. A powerful section of the British capitalist class constituted the first financial oligarchy. At this time, they became dominant. The trading of shares and involvement in a range of financial instruments was their day-to-day activity. They did nothing else. Direct concern for the production of commodities was only indirectly important to them. Increasing social surplus value and the ability to stake their claim on it was all that mattered. This group of capitalists can be called rentier capitalists. Their activity was to buy and sell shares in the emerging companies and to draw interest and dividends for the money they lend. By the end of the century, at least in the United Kingdom, British monopoly capitalism survived not on the creation of new surplus value. It survived on the circulation of money, which brought to it an ever-increasing, ever-expanding share of the social surplus value. That's a key transformation. They no longer depended on the creation of new surplus value, just redividing already existing social surplus value. This system of rentier capitalism was soon emerging in other most advanced capitalist countries. Eventually, when the domestic economy became saturated, the British rentiers became dependent on the export of capital to the colonies. Before this, the empire had mostly existed to supply raw materials for the industries that had come with the growth of the factory system. I'll do that one again. Before this, the empire had mostly existed to supply the raw materials for the industries that had come with the growth of the factory system and the slave trade and the circulation of other commodities on a global scale. Now it was for the circulation of capital as money on a global scale. So that's the transformation that occurred around this time. It was no longer primarily to circulate commodities globally, but to circulate money globally.
Yeah, you could see where the tentacles, the original roots of imperialism is, where basically what we're saying, where imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, it's monopoly capitalism, it's monopoly age. You can see where this is where it's rooted. It's not dependent on new surplus value, but the continuing one, and this is where it's grown to now. Continue. Sorry.
Well, if we look at how that period affected Australia or the Australian colonies, particularly Victoria and Melbourne, more than any others, that there was an influx from these rentiers of capital. It was initially over the gold discoveries. They wanted gold as well, so they as a commodity money, they wanted to exchange that for gold. But it was more than that. By the 1860s, in Melbourne alone, there were more than 200 banks. 200.
Wow.
It was one of the features that led to the depression of the 1890s. And most of them collapsed. And the immediate reason why is because this money was not being devoted to the creation of surplus value. It was devoted to land speculation. And the land bubble was a major part. It wasn't the only thing, but it was a domestic component to the depression of that time, was that land bubble crisis. So the reason is that the rise of monopoly and a specialized group of capitalists involved in the circulation and concentration of money accumulated enough capital to bring about a great expansion of extended reproduction. That's Marx's term. Extended reproduction means a higher level of production than the last cycle. If we take, for instance, that a factory produces X amount of commodities this year, next year, the capitalists will have to invent more to produce more commodities. So that's extended reproduction. It's the same amount plus some extra. Now, this has an effect on the organic composition of capital, which is another definition that I think needs a quick explanation. The organic composition of capital refers to the proportions of the two capitals, which is constant capital, which is machinery, tools, buildings, that physical stuff, and variable capital, which is the capital invested in labour power. So when the proportion moves towards constant capital, you say the organic composition of capital rises. When it becomes more labour intensive, the organic composition of capital lowers. So it's that relationship between the two capitals. Now, with the rise of monopoly and associated with the financial oligarchy, there was a tremendous increase in the scale of production, and this resulted in a huge rise in the organic composition of capital, and that had, as we shall see, big effects. So it rose enormously and reduced the rate of surplus value. The reason why a rising organic composition reduces the rate of surplus value is that you're using less labour power to produce a commodity. So that extra value that's created through labour power, well, there's less of it in the commodity. And the classic example in our era is computer technology. That the larger scale it's been produced and the more capital intensive it's become, the relatively cheaper computers become. Not because those who produce it are really generous people, but because the value has dropped. And therefore if we get the individual surplus values decreasing, the rate of social surplus value will decrease with it. And that's why I said sometimes up and down. In these conditions, the rate of social surplus value is also reducing. And that's really a key to the emergence of crisis. This meant that the return over the cost of production was shrinking. Now, I could introduce here that, and I won't explain it because we don't have time, that Marx worked out through, and it's been verified, that if we take an average across a society, you get an average organic composition, social organic composition of capital. In another area, if we're looking at that those who can compete we look at the cost of production. I'm not going to explain this now, just that if you can produce cheaper than the average, you make a profit. If you can't, you lose out. You go out of business. And that is tied up with circulation as well, and what you can claim. It's one of the things. Although monopolies reduce, they have a high organic composition of capital and help to reduce the social part, they can produce more cheaply. The reason why they intensify, go to greater capital intensity, is that they can produce more within a given time in terms of volume of commodities. So they can produce more cheaply than their competition. So they extract not only what they would normally. But that difference between the average and themselves, what's called monopoly profits. They can do that. It's the reason why supermarkets can also undercut the corner shop. But big factories can undercut small factories, and so on across society. But they can also raise their prices for other reasons because they've got the ability to do it. But we won't go into that now. This meant, the renter capitalists sought to, when this reached in different periods, well, it has in different periods of history, the organic composition of capital, or the social organic composition capital, raised to a level where the return on investment started falling. And when it got to a certain point where there was very little or no return of investment, the rentier capitals sought other places to put their money. And this is what gave rise to the export of capital, because the export of capital is based on exporting to countries that have a lower organic composition of capital, which means that their cost of production are higher, they're labor intensive, and so on. The exploitation of, and what is imperialism, what became known as imperialism, happens through the differences in the organic composition of capital. The differences mean that they can extract surplus value from other commodities. It is not about getting cheap resources so much and cheap labor. It's about being able overall to extract, because their organic composition of capital might be higher, but their cost of production are lower. And
Yep. Joe, I'm just also wary of time too. We've only got just about half an hour to go.
Okay, so that's how that works. So rentier capitals can be tracked back to the expansion of mercantilism, early capitalism in England, based on the transport of commodities from around the world to the emergent centres of capitalism. Those capitalists engaged in trade faced an elevated level of risk of the loss of cargoes, or through ship sinking, spoilage, piracy, all the things that happened. So it was a risky undertaking, but there was a huge return on it. Now, merchants used to meet on the London waterfront. There were two main cafes they used to meet at. You had to go there if you're a merchant, because that's where you heard all the news, what was going on, who was trading what, who was when a ship was going to take off and when one was going to arrive. And so they got to know each other, and and so on, and that they shared information and they made deals. But also sailors and captains went to the same cafes.
Yep. Just on that, when you look at the port areas of major capital cities, be it, traditionally it was the old Rocks, Woolloomooloo, and places in Piedmont and that in Sydney, and around Port Melbourne and that in Melbourne here, but also too over in Fremantle, which is the port city of Perth. You look at all the old buildings, merchants and traders everywhere, but they had actually coffee houses everywhere, but also pubs on every corner, and all that's where all the business was done. It was quite amazing. So you actually look at the architecture from that period, all the buildings from that period. That's what it was. You had Joe Bloggs, so merchants and traders, or John and Sons, merchants, and that. It was quite typically.
Well, it was the place to go. If you wanted to be a merchant, you had to go. And by the way, the British didn't drink tea in those days; they were coffee drinkers.
That's right.
That came a fair while later. But a group of them sitting around a table. I mean, one of these cafes decided to, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Someone saying, him over there, his ship went down last month. Somebody else went broke, and all this sort of stuff. And they came up with an idea.
Joe, Joe, can I Can I just go back just a tad and try and put on this idea of organic composition of capital? Is that the reason that they take industry to other countries?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So
Yeah.
it's
To be able to use their
extract.
advantage. Saying that these merchants decided a good idea. So they made an agreement that each put a certain amount of money in a pot, and if one of them wanted to organise an expedition or organise a ship to go and collect stuff, or wanted to act as a merchant but didn't have enough money, they could borrow out of this pot and then pay it back with a little bit of interest, right? So that operated at first from the cafe. When it grew, the merchants set up what became called the Bank of England. That was the first bank in the world. And they also set up an insurance company, Lloyd's of London. So there's the beginning of insurance, because they didn't only want to raise money for a cargo, they wanted to be covered in case they didn't get the cargo. So that's how that happened. Now that spread, but that was the germ. That's where companies emerged from. This pot on the coffee table where each put on a bit, they got a share of them. They had a share of the money there. Eventually, they started issuing certificates. So that share was converted into shares. But with the expansion of the empires, colonial empires, some of these people became exceedingly wealthy and branched out in all sorts of areas, and they became very powerful. And it wasn't long before the traditional manufacturing capitalists were tied hand and foot to them, because if they needed a loan, who did they have to go to? If the factory burnt down, who do they have to go to for insurance? If they wanted to expand production, who do they have to go to? And often, part of the deal, particularly if it was, it's a bit to pay back, was, all right, we'll take a share of your business instead. Yeah, we'll convert you into a company. We'll get a few lawyers around, and you have so much, and we have so much. So this is how companies arose and soon spread from England to other countries.
So just to put it in context, Joe, let's say Gina Reinhardt, for instance, Australia's richest woman, she owns X amount of mines, blah, blah, blah. Would it be fair to say that she doesn't actually own her mines because she would have had to borrow money from a bank to finance that industry, and therefore quite possibly that bank or whoever she financed from probably owns more in that company than what she actually owns?
Exactly. And it could be said that although she's worth so many squillions of dollars you read in the newspaper, she doesn't actually have them. What she has, for the role she plays, she has access to a lot of money. But if she had to suddenly count all the money she had, she'd have more than we've got, but a lot more, but not on that scale.
Yeah.
She cannot operate without the banks, not for a day.
Yeah.
They decide ultimately what she does.
If the banks decided that they wanted her to pay them back, she would be bankrupt.
Well, if she couldn't pay interest on the money she borrowed from them, and I don't have a clue what she borrows, but yeah, she could theoretically go into bankruptcy. But I'm sure she's got a few reserves that have tied her over for a while. She's not going to go to the poorhouse, but that's the case. She doesn't own all this wealth. She just has access to a good portion.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand, because when we talk about, there being a company that's Australian, BHP was Broken Hill Proprietary Limited. That's an Australian company, so we think. But then, of course, if you're borrowing money from international banks, which is where, which we know that Australian banks, for instance, are all tied up with the international banks, all owned by the international banks. So therefore, we would have to say that BHP is not an Australian company.
Well, just
and
so
anyway, it's got shareholder. It's been bought out many times over now.
Well, there's a real fallacy about BHP. BHP came into existence around 1914, 15, I think, somewhere around during the First World War, and it came about because obviously there were certain raw materials like iron. It was hard to get during the war, but it was never Australian owned. Never, ever. It was set up, and from the beginning, the biggest shareholder, the controller of BHP was AMP, the AMP Society, which is a creature of the British banks, Fleet Street. They provided the capital and they owned it. BHP. It's just that they set up, it was an early example where they shifted production offshore. Nowadays, of course, they don't, well, they've got a part of it, a decent part of it, but BHP's, the biggest shareholder is the Billiton family. That's why it's called BHP Billiton now. And they're in the United States. Yeah, one of the richest families there. Well, they have.
Can I also just comment? This is quite common in mining itself. You'll find even a lot of the old mines around Bendigo, for example. You've got the Central Deborah Gold Mining Company. It's a big historical mine. You're coming into Bendigo. It's on your right hand side. It's still actually an operating mine. They still actually use courses and that. It's an old underground gold mine, very classic. But you can see that. But that would have been all the banks, like banks put the investment in it. So it's not like a standalone company. Someone like John Smith's come along. I'm going to start this mining company on the back of my hand, and with my own money, and that I own it outright, and everything else. It didn't happen that way. You'll find all the mines as happened in Australia, but after the initial gold rushes, the 1850s, they actually they were founded by banks.
Yeah, and it's the way it goes. I mean, I've looked into it, I've researched it. I spent hours at the at ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, looking at the files, and what I found is that nearly every company is owned by the same people. We take the four banks; they're owned by the same people. We take any mining company. We take retail, the major retailers. We go across the board. I think there's one exception that, although I bet there's British capital, it's Optus. They're run by the Lee family that runs Singapore. They're owned 100% by them, but then they've always been linked to British capital. But there is a pattern emerges when you look at this. One day I was there, and this was before they computerized, they digitalized the files. They were hard copy files in those days. And because I've been there a few times, somebody behind the counter decided to give me a file they weren't supposed to give me. I wasn't allowed to keep it because there you've got to sign them. You've got to sign them back in because, very, very big deal there. But,
you could have just filled back of the truck.
Yeah, well, I had to sign them back in before I left. So I got the counter. I had a little room to go into, and I had a look at them. And out came a folder from the ANZ Bank. Now, one of the tricky things was that the main shareholders are what were called nominee companies. And nominee companies are like trust. They don't have to disclose anything. So nominee companies act for other people. They're like a middleman who channels huge amounts of money. But this file had within it the clients of key nominee companies that were investing in the ANZ Bank had a big portfolio. And they came from two places, most of them, New York, and the other place, which is, I suspect, a good indication, probably the same, is Switzerland, through Swiss bank accounts. And they owned our banks and still own our banks. Well, their proportion has gone down. I'll mention this in a tick, but they also owned every major company operating in Australia. Now, what has changed in the last 2 decades is that the owners have invested more directly. So now we've got a shift over that the two major owners of the 4 banks, ANZ's slightly different, that's still more British. But say the other, and there's still big players there. I can't remember that. What's that big British bank that operates? I can't remember. It's got a number of letters. HSBN or something like that. It just escapes me at the moment. Yeah, they're a big stake in the ANZ, but the other 3, which are the biggest, 2 banks, Citibank, number 1, Chase, number 2. So through them, they own most of the Australian economy. Correction, those who own those 2 banks own most of the economy, Australian economy. So that's what we face. We face a huge, massive cartel and monopoly. So if we want to do anything about that, if we want to do anything about how the banks and how finance operates in Australia, we have to pay attention to that. Well, I'll go on with this thing because there's not a huge amount left. I think there's a little bit. So I'll leave it, and then we can finish off with what I just said and what that means. That's okay. I believe that because I've already explained except limited liability. Well, it means that's protection against loss. So going on over the next page, I think organising this way had to allow for the entry and exit of individuals from the enterprise. So that was another factor of the emergence of banking and insurance. You could get in or out. In other words, you could buy and sell shares, while ensuring that the original entity remained. This was helped through the selling and buying of shares, as I just said. They began as private companies, eventually gave rise to stock exchanges. Well, the first stock exchange was the cafe. Then it got too small. The whole thing outgrew, and they had to have a special building for it. And this was replicated around the world. Stock exchanges are specialised markets for buying and selling shares. That's all they are. Nothing mysterious there. This is the essence of all company structures born in the British mercantile era and continue today. With mercantilism and the appearance of company structures, there came into existence the world of finance. Merchants were able to gain themselves further protection through insurance. I'm just running through this quickly, and a few of them specialised in that area. These developments meant that the rentier capitalists could link into the activities of the whole capitalist system through the provision of credit. And it's the invention of credit on a mass scale that became the vehicle for extending their power. When a new operation is planned or the old one expanded, capital is brought in from a larger number of capitalists. So on the scale of today's economy, no capitalist can finance their operation on their own. So they depend on getting from the pool that lots of capitals put in the pool, which we call the banking system, to be able to extract a bit out of it and then pay it back with interest later on. This gave rise to the creation of this gave rise to a group of capitalists who no longer relied on the direct creation of value through the process of production, to profiteering from the circulation of capital. This became so pronounced that those capitalists who remained tied to direct participation in production experienced a growing dependency on the rentier capitalists to keep on operating, not only to meet the next the need of raising capital, but also in the form of the overall capitalist relationships within which they had to exist. So it's not only the supply of capital, that the rentiers created the condition, and the conditions and the ability to establish relationships with other capitalists, which are necessary to do business. A key characteristic of the rentier capitalism is it does not create any value, which was said, and this means that its existence is based on siphoning off from the social surplus value created by others. Rentier capitalism is not intrinsically parasitic, though. It is a necessary part of advanced capitalism. But when it grows past the need of servicing the needs of extended reproduction and the circulation of commodities, that part in excess does become parasitic, for it harms the existing economic base. And the classic of that, which we're experiencing today, when this happens, that investment is withdrawn from manufacturing and put to places that give a higher return. That might be good for the rentier capitalists, but not so good for anyone else.
And this is classic. What's happening today, like you were saying, is that the banks are being given huge amount of money, or companies are being given huge amounts of money to stimulate the economy. But what do they do instead? They look to reinvest it, and they look to buy back their shares, or to buy shares. So they're not investing in the economy at all. They're just simply circulating money amongst themselves to make more money.
And this relationship that they have to society and the economy is what gives rise to speculative investment, futures markets, trading in currencies and futures commodities, real estate, the price of housing. That's what gives rise. I'll move on. I'll skip a couple of paras, and I want to move on because there's been a new division. Our earlier equations for the division of surplus value will now take the following forms. So for the individual capitalists, we had the S equals P plus I plus R. We need to divide the I into two components. So that is interest. Interest is now separated into, still got the I, which is interest, but we must add D, which represents other rentier payments such as dividends on shares, debentures, bonds, and participations in future markets and speculative ventures, because all these claim on the social surplus value. So we've got to add that to have a complete picture of what is going on. So that's why I has been divided into two, into I plus D. And that gives a more full picture of how society operates. In terms of the economic base, it transforms itself into the following, and that's with the social aspect on it. So it happens at the individual level because these, in a company structure, interest, what's it, the thing they pay out on dividends. Yeah, dividends on shares are paid out, but the company often invests in debentures. Debentures are like a kind of mortgage, a mortgage is a kind of debenture. It means they put up assets in return for a certain amount of capital. Bonds they buy from others, their certificates to be redeemed in the future. Most of them from government, but there are also private ones. Of course, futures markets is speculating on future prices, and currency is probably the biggest one. speculation on currencies when they fluctuate. That shift that brought about the rise of finance capitalists compared to other capitalists meant they came to claim a larger portion of social surplus value, and the other types of capitalists were left with less. The second half of the 19th century saw the most developed capitalist countries, the rentier capitalists, did not only do this domestically, but they also began to merge with the manufacturing capitalists, but also other capitalists. So
they basically started taking over everything, Joe.
Yeah, they started merging with them.
Capitalists started taking
which
over
I said,
everything.
like those banks, like the banks, own
Yep.
the controlling shares of other companies. So it was this merging that began as well in England, but spread to other places as well. When this extended onto a global scale, is what we now call imperialism. I'll go over to the next bit. Since rentier capitalism is dependent on the circulation of money, it must look to circulate that money elsewhere, and at any cost. Now, this is when, because I skipped the previous bit, is when the rate of surplus value and correspondingly the rate of return per dollar invested, whatever currency they use, is falling, and they're missing out. They must find somewhere else to put their investment. That is their class interest. In this way, rentier capitalism pushes further the shift from expanded reproduction, but also any form of production. So this disconnection between finance and production comes from there. It is the result of an emerging crisis in the economic base. But because the return to the rentiers, the rate of return is falling, their class interest or class instinct is, I'll pull my money out of there and I'll put it somewhere else where I can get a quick grab. And the circular money is even further divorced from the circulation of commodities. So that's the thing. It began to be divorced. And this weakening relationship between money as an exchange commodity for other commodities is weakened, and it starts being pulled apart until it gets to a point when a crisis deepens that the circulation of money is out of kilter with the circulation of commodities. And we're experiencing that right at the moment. When the capitalist economy reaches the point where the principal source of profit is interest and dividends and not the creation of surplus value, it is living on borrowed time and in danger of going over the edge. Raising the social surplus value is the only way out of this. And this is for a time resolved through a large claim on the global social surplus value. So if we look at that, just like in a nation, you have a social surplus value, you also have a global surplus value. And like Marx did, and people around Lenin's time, including him, argued that Marx not so much because he only began on this. He really didn't finish this side of it. But you get a global capitalist system which operates the same way. You have a global social surplus value. And the way that a section of capitalists extracts within a nation a larger share of the social surplus value operates the same way internationally through the global surplus value. And this is how imperialism exploits other nations. The classic example, which is currently operating, was founded after the Second World War with the Bretton Woods Agreement. So by the end of the 1940s, what had began and what had operated sporadically, there were weaker institutions, became a global system. Bretton Woods set up the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and in some respects, the United Nations tied, at least since early days, tied in with it. It put a sort of political pressure dimension. And it also is a reflection and tightened the connection between the rentier capitalists and the state, because the state was necessary to bring this about. And Bretton Woods cemented US supremacy as an imperialist power, at least the rentier capitalists from the US, because through this mechanism, conditions were put for access to capital on a global scale. And they included political conditions. So a government that didn't, and Australia was one of them, under Curtin, was looking at industrialising the country through local capital. There are many other countries that threatened to do this, and they were denied access to finance, which is necessary for international trade. So in fact, what they're doing to the Russians, they were doing all over the place at that time. It was tied together with the emergence of the Cold War, which they launched. So it added the political pressure, right? This is the way you organise your economy, no other way or else. I'd just like to move on to say to today, because from that point, because what we're experiencing today has its genesis at that time. Because this new financial system set up by the United States, Great Britain was involved in it as well, but it was the United States that was calling the shots, because the Great Britain owed the United States a fortune. So did most other countries, because guess who financed the war? And investment, it allowed the rentier capitalists of the United States, above all, to invest in reconstruction after the war. So we'll take the two classic countries, Germany and Japan. They rose so quickly, not because of internal capital initially, but because they were given cheap access to capital and involved. In fact, the United States resurrected their own rentier capitalists as a class who'd become dominant within their own spheres. They were resurrected under certain conditions. So those rentier capitalists, for instance, Japan and Germany, who were behind Hitler and Hirohito, on the other side of the war, they were brought back under certain conditions, that you become, you can't do exactly what you like. You've got to do it under our conditions. We've got to get some advantage out of it. Now, it was tremendously successful. It resulted in a capitalist boom. The problem with that is, as the capitalist boom proceeded and the organic composition of capital rose, the return of investment of that boom petered out, and it effectively ended around 1967. That was the time when the gold standard started to become wobbly. And it affected the United States most of all, because it was their rentier capitals that become dominant. Now, the response to that was initially to provide credit to cover interest payments. When that ran its course, an effort was made to impose more loans on developing countries, or then called third world countries. It worked for 2 or 3 years. Then there was the debt crisis of 73 and the oil crisis of 73, which was also connected to that. It was not about Arabs being too greedy, right? It was about they couldn't pay the loans. They needed they needed a bit more return for the loans. And one after another, countries were being forced in a position where they were going to default on their debt. Like Argentina did, Brazil, a few other countries coming close to it. So they turned around and thought, hang on, this isn't working anymore. What's the new one? They started turning attention to put the burden on developed economies. And they created, out of their own emerging and developing crisis, which they created, they also created neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an answer to that crisis. First of all, you impose debt on developed countries, and that's what they did. We got that through the 70s, into the 80s, and so on, and still. So a debt bubble grew. Eventually, that started going the other way. And we've got a real problem because we got 2008-9, we had was a global financial crisis. That's where it came from. So what was the answer to that, the global financial crisis? Because they came fairly close to toppling the whole thing over. Well, two things. And neoliberalism had already started that off. But the idea was to intensify that, and that was to decrease the wages share. Number one. We've had that going on, racing along since then. Still going. The other one was to press harder to gain the assistance of the state, to provide capital and profit, cheap capital, privatisation, grants, and so on. There was another one, and that was to create more advantageous situations for the companies run by the rentier capitalists, again, through the state. But also, that part that wasn't privatised, they brought about the ideology, which was their need, of corporatisation. And that means that all sectors of society have got to be turned into, they've got to look like corporations. That was an idea that was invented by Mussolini in Italy and was taken up by Hitler in Germany, various others. It's the core of fascism. But this one's a slightly more gentle version, but the idea is that even the community sector, in order to get funding, in order to deal with government, has to corporatise. We get that in education, we get that everywhere. Unfortunately, even the trade unions have gone that direction. They've started to corporatise. That's become the mantra. But the reason for it is so the financial oligarchy can discipline society in a way that it allows it to continue on its course, to squeeze developed countries off their surplus value. That's what it's for, ultimately. Now, this is not a solution. As I read out just before, the only solution to that is to increase the rate of surplus value. It's the only way that the economy can be brought, that finance or the circulation of money, commodities can be brought back together. The only way that manufacturing can be restored, and a balance between all sections of the economy. So that tells us there's a couple of things we need to do. One is to regain control over the financial economy. It needs to be regulated to make sure that finance is used in a way that meets the needs of society. That's number one. Number two is to further cut the power of the financial oligarchy in Australia. So what do we need to do? Well, part is regulating, yes. But a big part is we need to set up alternative instruments to supply capital. And I want to bring up three types of banks that should be established. This should be demanded of any Australian government.
Just be quick with that because we are going beyond time.
Yeah.
That's all.
One is we need a bank like the kind of banks, the four banks where, ordinary banking is done by ordinary people, right? Two, we need a bank that specializes in economic development, right? That supplies government and contractors and some sections of the private sector the capital for expanded reproduction above all. We need a third kind of bank, which is government owned, and that is an infrastructure bank. Because an economy does not go around, it does not operate properly without appropriate infrastructure. By this, I mean power, transport, and various other needs that are required by society as a whole, by an economy to operate. And it also means that that this must be extracted in a way, or the cost of this must be covered on the principle that each contributes to their capacity. So the third element, the final element that needs to be done in Australia, as well as other countries, but in Australia, we're talking about what we need to do, is to do away with money laundering and tax evasion on an industrial scale. That would raise capital to finance the three banks on its own. We need to finally reform the taxation system so the burden falls fairly according to those principles of each contributes to their capacity. And I think we cannot talk about solving problems of emerging economic crisis, let alone create a better society, unless we first of all take that stuff on board.
Yep. Yeah, spot on there, and it gets actually vital. I think it'd be good we can continue the discussion in the next live in a couple of weeks, and we can add a lot more material there. But it's vitally important that we start having a look at this because, I mean, people talk about how the banks are horrible and this and the tax rules and everything else, but if we can come up with something like a proper concrete plan to how to deal with this, that'd be the way forward to present it to everyone. Look, we will need to finish up. It is 8:45. We went a little bit over than the hour and a half today, but that was actually quite a really extensive read that, but it was a really good one to actually understand that. I did write the algebra, what do you want to call the mathematical formulas up there. I'm sorry to confuse everyone, but that was just so you were following on what we were trying to talk about there. So, look, I thank you everyone once again. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Joe. And thank you for the contribution tonight. And we'll leave it there. And I just want to end it off as workers of all countries unite. Thank you.
Enjoy.
Enjoy, Bert.